Hello, lovelies. You're listening to episode 51 of the Broken Enchantments podcast, written and read by Elizabeth Wheatley. That's me. I hope you enjoy this week's episode. Be sure to check out my Patreon for next week's episode, now available. You can check out the links below. Happy listening. Valmahken was built high in the mountains with 3 gates, one facing the Staspen Waste, the second, Slaven, and the third, Brevia. Each gate had once led to a road into the respective countries. Janir, Amilla, Canicade, Cerilius, and 2 others Janir hadn't met before were meant to go on the hunt. Knistrith had suggested it after Janir had again brought up the family names of her late personal guards. The promised list from the secretariats had never arrived. Knistrith had essentially refused to answer, only making Janir push her harder until her aunt walked away. When the opportunity arose, Janir would ask Lucan. She'd ask the Lord Argotolum himself and every honor guard she could find if it came to that. Janir had tried being patient, and then she had been distracted, but no more. It had been more than a week in the fortress, and rations of fresh meat were becoming scarce. As the riders made their way through the Brevian gate, Janir almost pulled her horse to a halt so she could stare at the view. Stretching away from the foot of the mountain was a vast plain punctuated by gently sloping hills and a frozen river. Everything was covered in white. Brevia had gotten far more snow from the past day's storms than the ghostly city. In the distance was the black shape of Lares, the capital of Ivydown. Her father had said it was the first city they meant to take. Pushing down that sick feeling, Janir maneuvered her mare to fall into line behind the other riders. Cerilius claimed the lead, surveying the freshly fallen snow for any signs of disturbance. After a while, they split up, riding about 50 yards apart but parallel. Fortunately, though the snow was powdery cold, there was no wind, and that was something all the hunters were grateful for. Janir rode with Cerilius when they split up. It was a good thing he took command, because she didn't remember a thing about tracking animals. After about a half hour, someone shouted. Cerilius said they must have found a trail. All the riders converged, and they set off along the animal's path, following its tracks at a trot. A while later, they split up again, hoping to surround their prey. Janir was thoroughly bored by that point. She had no idea what she was doing and not particularly interested in learning. "There he is!" someone shouted, and the chase was on. Everyone spurred their horses in pursuit. Cerilius led the way, and Janir steered her mare after him. The horse's hooves flung snow and clumps of earth into the air. Janir thought how terrifying it must be for the stag to hear his hunters thundering up behind him. Still, she appreciated the change of pace. Janir's mare pinned back her ears and charged after Cerilius's mount with no urging. Meanwhile, Janir hadn't even seen the stag yet. "There he goes!" shouted Amilla from somewhere off in the trees. Janir still didn't see him. If anything, she found herself pitying their quarry. What had the stag ever done to them? The horses' coats began to gleam with sweat in spite of the cold, and puffs of steam billowed from their nostrils with every stride. But there was still no sign of slowing as the horses and riders plowed through the pine trees, hot on the trail of their prey. Janir tried to rein in her mount so Cerilius could stay in the lead, but her mare snorted and grabbed the bit in her teeth. Janir sawed the reins from side to side, trying to work it loose. The mare had other ideas. The horse fainted to one side, sending Janir into a snowbank. Janir groaned and stiffly pushed herself off the ground, face powdered in white. She looked up in time to see her mare, reins flapping and stirrups swinging, disappear into the forest. Damnable animal. About 70 paces ahead, Cerilius stopped his stallion and turned back. "I'm fine," Janir shouted, waving him on. "I had a soft landing. Go ahead." Cerilius waited until he'd seen her clamber to her feet before he spurred his mount after the stag once more. Janir flexed her jarred muscles. Moments later came a shout, and then quiet. Someone must have hit the deer, and they were probably waiting for it to bleed out or collapse so they could finish the job. Even though she hadn't so much as glimpsed the creature, she pitied it. With a sigh, she trudged to the broken branches of the pine trees where her mare had plunged into the undergrowth. It didn't make any sense why the infernal mare had been fighting to follow that stag and then gone off blundering in nearly the opposite direction. Janir growled wordlessly. She felt like the animal was doing it just to spite her. Following the deep tracks in the snow, Janir marched on, up to her knees in the deeper areas. She fought to make it through the piles of white and the dead brambles and briars that hadn't rotted away since last year. The horse would have been able to leap over all of that almost effortlessly without a rider, Janir thought bitterly. Through the trees, Janir caught a flash of chestnut in the forest of brown and white. She grabbed a branch to help propel herself forward just as she detected the glow of magic. 2 sources. One was a steady glow of magic. It was small, yet undeniable. The other webbed and splotched in a fluid pattern, not quite the same from one moment to the next. "What? You don't think horses have love at first sight?" Janir stopped. The Argatolums weren't as alone in these forests as they had thought. "I think you are attributing human emotions to animals," a second stranger responded. Cautiously, Janir trudged between the entwined branches of 2 pines. In front of her was her mare, ears pricked as she inquisitively sniffed a short, shaggy gray pony. Atop the pony was a Brevian boy in a robe much too large for him, with spiky red hair. Beside the pony was another horse, a spotless, snow-white mare. The mare was ridden by an elf who looked young, but that didn't mean he was. Snow was up to the horses' bellies, and both riders were thoroughly dressed for the weather. Janir thought they must have been passing through the forest when her mare turned up. The elf had a sword at his side. That probably meant they weren't here for the deer. She leaned against a bow in front of her, trying to see better. Janir had hardly laid eyes on the scene when her horse nipped at the shaggy pony. The pony squealed and lashed out a hoof in retaliation. The elf swung out of his saddle and caught the mare's bridle, pulling her away from the pony while the pony's rider tried to get his minuscule mount back under control. "As I was saying," the elf snapped. "All right, so it wasn't love," the boy conceded. "Where do you think she came from?" he asked, pointing to Janir's mare. The branch under Janir's hand snapped, and hardly an instant later, the elf was staring squarely at her. "Hey, Goblin. Yikes. Janir? Janir? How in hell did this happen?" The boy flipped off his short pony and rushed to stand beside the elf. The elf blinked once, deliberately, as if he expected her to disappear. The boy kept talking and moving toward her. "Why are you wearing that? We came here because of rumors, but we never dared hope. Oh, I'll never doubt that miracles happen." The elf was still holding the reins of Janir's mare, but he shoved the reins to the boy and stepped toward her himself. The elf looked so happy, relieved, and surprised all at the same time. "Who are you?" Janir demanded, backing away. "How do you know my name?" Fear began to settle in, fear that should have been there from the start. The elf paused, looking her up and down. Janir, it is Seovan. Janir eyed him suspiciously. You do not remember me. His voice caught ever so slightly on the last word. Should I? For an instant, the strangest idea flitted across her mind, that she should remember. Logic told Janir that she was in danger, yet she didn't feel like it.
What? Do you remember me? Janir, it's me. Carlisle. Don't you?
The elf, Seovan, turned back to Carlisle. He shook his head mournfully. There is no use. Who are you? Janir repeated.
What's going on?
Carlisle demanded. She did not escape. Seovan kept staring. It made her skin tingle.
But that doesn't make any kind of sense. She's here, isn't she?
I'm not alone, Janir interrupted. She felt like she should say that. My cousin and 5 others are out here, and they're going to be looking for me. You should go before they get here. The sentence she had begun as a threat ended as a warning. What are they doing? Seovan asked. Hunting. My horse threw me, and you really should go. Janir shook her head, a sharp throb starting in her temple. From about 100 paces off, hidden in the trees, Ceruleus called her name. Carlisle. The elf whirled on the boy. You need to go.
I beg your pardon,
Carlisle retorted. Argatolums are coming, and you are an enchanter. A pathetic excuse of an enchanter, Carlisle sputtered with indignation. But an enchanter, nonetheless. Besides, someone has to tell what we found.
This isn't fair, Carlisle protested. First Janir, now you. What did I ever do you'd sacrifice yourself for me? I don't deserve the guilt.
Carlisle, go, Seovan ordered.
What about you and Janir?
Carlisle glanced between the two of them. I will try, but you need to go, the elf ordered. This instant. Seovan hauled Carlisle back to the pony. Get out of here. Carlisle begrudgingly swung on board the little gray steed. Tell my father what we found. Now hurry. Seovan slapped the little pony's rump, and it streaked off into the underbrush with Carlisle clinging to its back. Once Carlisle was away, Seovan turned back to Janir. You should go too, she advised. Janir. Go, Janir pleaded. What they'll do to you will be just as bad as what they do to Carlisle. We are here because of rumors of a Slavish army. We're spies for the Brevians. You would help 2 spies escape. Seovan took a step closer. No, but you aren't. Just go before I change my mind. I left you once before, and have regretted it every day since. Seovan didn't take another step toward her, but his intent stare warned her he was about to. Janir's mare had begun snuffling through the snow in search of late winter greenery. Janir caught the animal's reins. The elf made her too confused, and she knew he was dangerous. She was just about to swing aboard her mount's back when Seovan grasped her arm. Janir, I know you have no memory of me, but I need you to trust me, he pleaded. You trusted me before. You know it. You must know it. Trust me again. Janir paused. It made no sense, this vast sense of conflict that sprang from nowhere. She felt as if her mind were at war. Let go of me, she stammered. She half-heartedly tugged her arm free. Janir heard Ceruleus's mount plowing through the snow close by. His Stygian presence was close, to the right. He called to her again. One shout would bring him straight away. That was all she had to do. Janir gathered up the reins and slipped her foot into the stirrup. Sayavan caught her shoulders and pulled her down. She tried to shove him away, but he backed her against the trunk of a pine tree. "Let me go," Janir snapped, not as viciously as she should have. "Janir." Sayavan pulled something from a pocket in his tunic. "Do you remember this?" He held up a glimmering blue stone encased in delicate wires, securing it to a slender silver chain. Sayavan slipped it into her hand. "I once gave this to you." She stared at the stone in her palm. It was about the size of a walnut and glowed softly, like the light of a star. She didn't remember it, any more than she remembered the torture that had claimed her memories. "I do not know what lies fill your head, but you're in danger. You need to get away from the Argatolums now." "You're lying," Janir countered. He had to be. "I'm the Lord Argatolum's firstborn. Aside from the traitors..." Janir cut herself off as she realized she shouldn't tell him about that. "Janir." His hands tightened on her shoulders. Part of Janir wished she could believe him. "Why haven't you reached for your carcatan?" "What?" "I grabbed you. I pulled you off your horse, and yet you have made no move for them." Janir was suddenly as muddled and uncertain as she had been when she had awakened in her chambers. She should flick out a carcatan and whip the elf across the face. Yet she didn't. Why hadn't she run away when she had first seen them? Why hadn't she called for help? What the hell was wrong with her? Janir couldn't say Sayavan was familiar. She was sure she had never seen him before in her life. But there was something so wanted about him. Janir traced the side of his face with her fingertips. Who was he? Was he some sort of mage who had found a way to manipulate an Argatolum's emotions? Or could he, just possibly? Sayavan brightened with hope, so much hope, when she reached out and touched him. "Please, Janir, come with me," he pleaded. "I can help you. I'll find a way." It crossed her mind that she wanted to melt into his arms, but her feelings had been wrong and confused about Knistrith and Adasha. Why wouldn't they be confused now? It was most likely that Sayavan had done her harm, or tried to in the past, and now everything was backwards in her mind. Steeling her resolve, Janir forced herself to pull back. Let me go." "Janir." Sayavan shook his head in a wordless plea. "I said let me go." Janir twisted out of his grip and dashed for the forest. She had barely gone 5 paces when Sayavan tackled her into the snow. He pinned her arms and clamped a hand over her mouth before she could scream. Janir kicked and struggled with all her might, but he was stronger, faster. "I am sorry, I truly am, but this is for your own good." Sayavan hauled her to her feet, keeping his hand over her mouth. Janir couldn't break free. She stomped and kicked backwards, hitting his shins. She stretched for her carcatan, but couldn't reach. At least 3 Argatolums were close. She could feel it. They meandered through the trees, searching for her, but with no idea she was being abducted. Panic began to take over. Janir managed to get his hand off, if only for a moment. "Cerilius!" she screamed. "Cerilius!" The elf clapped his hand back over her mouth and hastily dragged her to his white mare. Janir kept fighting without success. Sayavan picked her up to sling her over the front of his mare's saddle. Wrenching her body to the side, she attempted to flip off his shoulder. The elf grunted and staggered, but kept his balance and his hold. "Release her, elf," Cerilius commanded. He must have already been on her trail. Relief washed over Janir as he swung down from his stallion's saddle, both carcatan drawn. Sayavan put her down, but he didn't let her go. He stood behind Janir and kept his arms around her like a vice, with one hand pinning her wrists to keep her from punching him. "I said release her," Ceruleus growled. Cannocade broke through the trees to the left of Seovan and Janir, a loaded crossbow leveled at the elf. "Ceruleus, what's going—" Amilla came up behind Ceruleus, and when she saw the scene in front of them, she dismounted her horse and brandished her carcatan. "Let the girl go, and I promise to kill you quickly." The elf still made no move to release Janir. "How long did it take?" "What?" Ceruleus cocked his head at an angle. "How long did it take for you to do this to her?" Seovan's grip tightened on her wrists, and his arm clenched around her waist. "I have done nothing to her, I assure you." Amilla deliberately circled around behind the elf. "You know very well what I mean," Seovan snarled. He kept an eye on Amilla as she made her way to stand behind him, but he didn't move to do anything about it. "You accuse me. You, the man who's using her as a human shield." Seovan didn't reply, but Janir was certain he must be glaring viciously at Ceruleus. As he sized up his opponents, Janir could feel the elf's sharp, warm exhale on her neck, his breath quickening with the threat of danger. The hammering of his heart pulsed against her back. His arm flexed around her, clinging tightly. There was something in that, something intimate. She tried not to dwell on it. "Seovan," Janir whispered, "if you don't let me go, they're going to kill you." "No, they will want to interrogate me first," Seovan acridly retorted. "Release her. She's of no use to you." Ceruleus advanced coolly on the elf. Seovan muttered a string of words in Elvish and kissed her hair. Janir was still stunned when he shoved her into Ceruleus, who automatically dropped his carcatan to catch her. With inhuman reflexes, Seovan drew his sword and whirled around to deal with Amilla. Amilla hadn't been expecting that, but she knocked the blade away and skirted to the side. The horses nickered nervously and backed well out of danger, except for the elf's pristine white mare who stayed nearby, watching her master uneasily. Amilla was forced to get in between Cannocade and Seovan, keeping Cannocade from shooting. The elf must have planned as much. Ceruleus pushed Janir behind him and picked up his carcatan in an instant. Janir scrambled to her feet as Ceruleus lunged for Seovan. There was a clang as sword and carcatan met. Seovan and Ceruleus exchanged blows for a moment, then Ceruleus shouted in fury as Seovan sliced him across the chest, drawing blood. "You son of a—" Ceruleus focused all his energy into his return blow and didn't finish the sentence. "Ceruleus!" Cannocade shouted. Ceruleus jerked backwards, out of harm's way. Hardly an instant later, Cannocade's crossbow twanged. Seovan fainted, but Cannocade had planned on it. Even though the elf moved with an inhuman speed, the bolt tore into his left shoulder. Seovan gasped and swallowed, his eyes wide. Janir shuddered and backed against a rough pine trunk. That must hurt. That must hurt so very much. Cannocade threw down the crossbow and traded it for his carcatan. The 3 Argotalums attacked at once. Seovan cut Amilla just above the knee before Ceruleus drove a carcatan into Seovan's back. Seovan dropped his sword and fell to his knees with a wordless cry of pain. Cannocade kicked the sword out of Seovan's reach as Ceruleus jabbed him with the carcatan again. The rod shrieked, and Seovan groaned. Tears welled in Janir's eyes. She didn't like seeing anyone hurt, but the thought of Seovan's suffering... Oh, she was so confused. Amilla staggered and leaned against a low branch for support as blood coursed from her wound and soaked her shin in scarlet. Grimacing, she surveyed the damage. "All right? That hurt?" Ceruleus also backed away and assessed his own injury. As blood stained the front of his tunic, He looked like he was wearing a giant crimson bib. "You'll pay dearly for this," he muttered to Seovan. Kanakade stood over the elf, practically smirking. "Luristi," Seovan groaned. The white mare pricked her ears in recognition. The elf said something in his native tongue. The mare snorted and stomped her feet uneasily. Seovan repeated the command before anyone could stop him, louder this time. The mare squealed in frustration before whirling around and galloping off into the forest. Amila snarled for Seovan to be quiet, and Cerilius kicked him again. Seovan remained still for a moment, doubled over with pain before he wrapped his right hand around the shaft of the arrow, wincing. The other 3 Argotolums were talking about what to do with the elf as Janir watched Seovan steel his face and shove the bolt all the way through so that it came out his back. Slowly he reached around and tore it loose. Seovan's mouth opened as if he were about to cry out, but he clenched his eyes shut and fought the pain. He lowered his face wordlessly, but his knuckles went white as he gripped the freed bolt in one hand. Janir found herself aching to do something to help him, though she didn't know what. Kanakade laughed. "What's so funny?" Amila demanded. "That you, my superiors, so desperately needed my help to take down one little elf." Kanakade smugly ran his fingers along his crossbow string. "We took him down. You just put a stick through him to make the job easier," Cerilius snarled. "To make the job possible," Kanakade corrected. Kanakade didn't see Seovan glare up at him, but Janir did. She couldn't take her eyes off the elf. Janir realized what Seovan was going to do an instant too late, and before she could do anything, the elf took the crossbow bolt from his shoulder and stabbed it into Kanakade's boot, just at the ankle. Yelling in surprise, Kanakade stumbled backwards, bolt protruding from his foot. Kanakade crashed into the snow in a spray of white, sputtering. Cerilius kicked Seovan's wounded shoulder for that. The elf stayed doubled over on the ground, clutching his wound protectively. "Ah!" Kanakade screamed, wide-eyed in horror. I've got an arrow sticking out of my foot."
"We noticed,"
Amila clipped unsympathetically. "Oh, fumets," Kanakade muttered, sinking to the ground. "So this is what it's like to be shot." "No," Cerilius corrected. "That's what it's like to be stabbed with your own crossbow bolt by your own prisoner."
"It's not funny,"
Kanakade snarled. "I think so," Cerilius replied with a perfectly blank expression. "Janir, go find the others." Amila nudged Seovan with her carcatan, earning a cry from him. Janir flinched. "We'll need help getting this back to Valmahken. The Lord Argotolum may want a few words with him." In Janir's hand, she clutched at the constancy star so tightly she feared it would break the skin. A wave of nausea bubbled up the back of her throat, and she covered her mouth, looking away. She took deep breaths as they bound Seovan's hands. You have been listening to Broken Enchantments, written and read by Elizabeth Wheatley. Don't forget to check out my Patreon for early access to episodes, bonus content, and lots of patrons-only freebies. You can learn more at elizabethwheatley.com. And don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform or YouTube. I'll see you next time.